Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The morning of December 30th, 2025, arrived the way winter mornings do in Columbus, Ohio, gray and quiet, the streets still carrying the weight of the holiday pause between Christmas and New Year's. In the Wineland Park neighborhood, a brick house on North 4th Street sat still in the cold. Inside, everything appeared, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. There was no shattered window, no kicked-in door, no sign on the exterior that anything at all had gone wrong in the night. But inside those walls, behind a facade of ordinary stillness, 2 people who had built a life together lay dead. And upstairs their children, a 4-year-old girl and a 1-year-old boy, were alive, crying, and waiting for parents who would never come to them again. To understand how December 30th, 2025, became one of the most devastating days in the lives of dozens of people, it is necessary to begin not with that morning, but years earlier, with a love story and another story that had turned dark long before the winter settled in. Monique Teep was born on October 14th, 1986, in Chicago, Illinois, but she grew up in Worthington, Ohio, in a household that raised her with warmth and a sense of possibility. She was the kind of child who ran for the joy of running. She played soccer, took up cross-country, and found a quiet happiness in horses and books. When she arrived at Ohio State University, she pursued a master's degree in early childhood education, a discipline that reflected the way she moved through the world. With care, with attention to those smaller and more vulnerable than herself. She was the kind of person who noticed children, who understood what they needed. Spencer Teep was born on December 9th, 1988, in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he carried the studious determination of someone who had set his sights early and never looked away. He, too, found his way to Ohio State University, where he earned both his undergraduate degree and his Doctor of Dental Surgery. He was a dentist who built his practice in Athens, Ohio, where his work encompassed comprehensive care, implant-related procedures, and the quiet act of helping people feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable. He played soccer and golf, spoke fluent Spanish, and had the kind of presence that people describe, afterward, as someone who made you feel like you mattered. They met online in 2018, in the careful, slightly self-conscious way that people do when they have chosen to be deliberate about love. For Monique, this was particularly significant. She had been married before, briefly, unhappily, and what she had endured in that marriage had left marks she carried quietly. The process of trusting someone new with the ordinary intimacies of daily life was not simple or automatic for her. But Spencer, by every account, was patient, and in 2020 they married. In 2022, their daughter was born. In 2024, their son arrived. They had a dog. They had a home on North 4th Street in the Wineland Park neighborhood of Columbus. They had, in the architecture of their daily life, everything that a future is supposed to look like. The exhaustion of parenting toddlers, the routines of work, the warmth of a household still figuring itself out and finding the rhythm of 2 people building something together. But to tell the full story, one must go back further still, to the year 2015, when Monique married a man named Michael David McKee. McKee was 39 years old at the time of the events that would unfold in 2025, and he worked as a surgeon in Rockford, Illinois. On paper, he was a professional who had achieved what society recognizes as success, a medical degree, a career status. But those closest to Monique described a different reality. The marriage lasted in name less than a year. Monique and McKee separated in March 2016, just 7 months after they wed. Monique filed for divorce in June 2017. According to her family and friends, the marriage had been shadowed by emotional abuse, a pattern of control, fear, and isolation that left Monique permanently altered. Her brother-in-law, Rob Misley, would later say to reporters with quiet devastation, she was terrified because he had threatened her life on multiple occasions when they were married. She wasn't shy about talking to people about traumatic experiences she had with her ex, and just how emotionally abusive he was to her. It affected her to this day. A witness relayed to investigators that Monique had claimed McKee had also been physically abusive, and a court affidavit would later record that McKee had allegedly told Monique, in the years that followed their divorce, that he could find her at any time, and that she will always be his wife. That phrase, "she will always be his wife," is the kind of sentence that, repeated in a courtroom, makes the air feel thin. It suggests not a person in grief over a failed marriage, but a person who had never accepted that the marriage had ended at all. Monique moved forward. She built a new life. She met Spencer online. She remarried. She had children. She made a home. She did what people who have survived difficult relationships are told to do. She chose differently. She chose better. She chose a future. But shadows, as those who have lived inside them know, do not simply disappear because a person walks away from them. The weeks before December 30th, 2025, carried details that would only later be understood as pieces of a pattern that had been building. On December 6th, 2025, more than 3 weeks before the killings, surveillance cameras captured what investigators would later describe as McKee allegedly entering the area immediately surrounding the Teep residence, approaching from the rear alley. That detail alone, the rear alley, the approach from behind, does not describe curiosity. It describes deliberateness. He departed after a period of time. No one was home, because on that same evening, Monique and Spencer were not in Columbus. They were in Indianapolis, Indiana, with friends, attending the Big Ten championship football game. The couple had traveled together, part of a group enjoying one of those ordinary, joyful social excursions that punctuate a year. But during the evening, something shifted for Monique. She returned to their hotel room earlier than the rest of the group. Later, Spencer confided to a friend that she had become upset about something involving her ex-husband. He did not elaborate further. He went back to check on her. The evening continued, and whatever had disturbed Monique in that hotel room was not discussed publicly. McKee, the court affidavit noted, was not scheduled to work on December 6th. This was not the first warning. The affidavit recorded that a witness told police McKee had threatened Monique that he could find her at any time and by the house right next to hers. These were not idle words spoken in the heat of an argument and immediately forgotten. They were words that Monique repeated to people close to her, words she carried because they frightened her in a way she could not entirely set aside. On the night of December 29th into the early hours of December 30th, 2025, the house on North 4th Street was quiet. The children were asleep. Spencer and Monique had no reason to expect what was coming. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever entered that house that night did not need to break anything to get inside. What happened in the interior of that home in the darkness between approximately 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. was witnessed by no one in a position to tell the story directly. What the evidence would later show is this: 16 gunshots were fired inside that house. Monique was struck 9 times, in the face, multiple times in the chest, near her heart, in her waistline, her right forearm, her right hand, and twice in her left arm. One of those shots was fired at close range. Spencer was struck 7 times, in the head, the neck, the chest, and his extremities. The coroner's office confirmed both manners of death as homicide. 3 spent 9mm casings were recovered at the scene. No firearm was found, and in the unbroken silence that followed, the 2 people who had built a life inside that house were gone. Their children were still upstairs. The dog was unharmed. And outside, somewhere in the night, a car was already heading back toward Illinois. The morning of December 30th, 2025, began as a work day for Spencer. He was expected at his dental practice. When he did not arrive, and when calls to both him and Monique went unanswered, the unease that began among his colleagues moved quickly toward alarm. At 8:58 a.m., Spencer's employer, who was on vacation, contacted Columbus police to request a welfare check. He had heard from his staff that Spencer had not shown up and that no one could reach either of them. An officer was dispatched at 9:10 a.m. and arrived at 9:15 a.m. But in what would later become a painful detail of the morning, the officer went to the wrong address. He knocked, received no response, and left. The calls kept coming. At 9:56 a.m., a man who had gone to the correct address phoned police, reporting that he could hear the children inside the house but could not get in. 2 minutes later, a female coworker driving to the residence also called to express concern. These were the sounds of people who loved Spencer and Monique refusing to be reassured by absence, insisting that something was wrong when every unanswered call confirmed it. At 10:03 a.m., someone who had managed to enter the house called 911. They had found Spencer unresponsive on the floor next to the bed. Blood was visible. Police were dispatched again. At 10:04 a.m. officers arrived and found both Spencer and Monique deceased. Columbus Fire Department Medic 7 formally pronounced them dead at 10:11 a.m. In the space of those 13 minutes, a neighborhood became a crime scene, and the children, who had been inside the house through the long hours of the night, were found unharmed. The grief that descended on the people who had loved Spencer and Monique was the specific, violent kind that arrives without warning, not the grief of illness or old age, which allows at least the mercy of preparation, but the grief of being told abruptly, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, that 2 people were gone. Later, visitation was held on January 11, 2026, at a funeral home in Upper Arlington. The family estimated that attendance exceeded 1,000 people. Investigators from the Columbus Division of Police faced a crime scene that, on the surface, offered only fragments. No weapon had been left behind. No door had been broken. No obvious witness had seen anything at the moment it mattered most. But evidence, in modern criminal investigation, is not only what is left at a scene. It is the accumulated record of a person's movements through a world that is watched by cameras and tracked by signals. On January 5, 2026, Columbus police released surveillance footage showing an unidentified man walking through the alley near the Teep residence between 2 and 5 a.m. on December 30th, the estimated window of the killings. The footage was grainy in the way alley camera footage always is, but it showed a figure moving with purpose, not the aimless wandering of someone who happened to be passing through. Police asked the public for help in identifying the man. Investigators did not only have cameras. They had vehicle tracking data, and the story that data told was detailed and specific. A car associated with Michael McKee arrived in the Wineland Park neighborhood shortly before the estimated time of the homicides and left soon afterward. That car was then traced along its route, back north and west through Ohio into Illinois toward Rockford, a journey that amounted to approximately 900 miles driven in a single night. 900 miles is not a confused man driving without direction. 900 miles, in the dark hours surrounding a double homicide, in a car whose movements match the timing of those homicides, is a story that tells itself. Investigators compared the surveillance footage with what they knew about McKee. They identified him as the man in the alley. They had his December 6th appearance on camera, near the Teep home, when the couple was away in Indiana. They had the affidavit recording of his alleged threats against Monique. They had the accounts of family members describing years of fear. And on January 14th, the Columbus police chief stood before reporters and described the killings as a targeted, domestic violence-related attack. That phrase, targeted, domestic violence-related, said plainly what the facts were assembling to suggest. This was not random. This was not mistaken identity. This was the final act of a pattern that had begun a decade earlier in a marriage that should never have become what it became. On January 10th, 2026, 11 days after the killings, Michael David McKee was arrested in Illinois. He was found at a Chick-fil-A restaurant near his workplace in Winnebago County, a mundane location for a moment that carried enormous weight. He was charged with 2 counts of murder. During a search of his property, investigators recovered a firearm they said was consistent with the weapon believed to have been used in the homicides. A Franklin County grand jury returned its indictment on January 16, 2026, charging McKee with 4 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of aggravated burglary. He was extradited to Ohio and booked into the James A. Carnes Correctional Center on January 20, 2026. 3 days later, on January 23rd, he appeared in Franklin County Municipal Court and entered a plea of not guilty to all charges. He is being held without bail. If convicted, McKee faces a minimum sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 32 years. His legal representative declined to provide a public statement regarding the case. What the court documents and the police briefings and the news reports cannot adequately convey is what was taken. Spencer Teep was 37 years old, a dentist who spoke Spanish and played golf on weekends, a father who had known his daughter for only 3 years and his son for barely 1. Monique Teep was 39, a woman who had survived a frightening first marriage, rebuilt her sense of safety piece by piece, and found in Spencer something she had believed in enough to build a family around. They had met online and chosen each other slowly and carefully, and they had made 2 children in a house that was supposed to hold decades more of ordinary life. Rob Misley, Monique's brother-in-law, spoke to reporters in January with the careful composure of someone holding enormous pain. He described the way Monique had tried to move forward, the way she had spoken to people about what she had endured, the way she had not hidden her fear but had, in the way that survivors of abuse often do, learned to carry it alongside her and keep living anyway. She was terrified, he said, because he had threatened her life on multiple occasions when they were married. That terror, it seems, had never entirely left her, and had, ultimately, found its way through a rear alley on a cold December night to a house where 2 children slept upstairs and a dog waited without understanding. The case, as of early 2026, remains in the pretrial phase. McKee has pleaded not guilty. The legal process is ongoing. The children who were found that morning inside the house on North 4th Street are alive, and they are being cared for. What their lives will carry forward, what understanding they will one day have to build about the people they lost and the circumstances in which they were lost, belongs to a future that no court date can shape or schedule. What the case of Spencer and Monique Teep leaves behind, for those watching from the outside, is not primarily a story of criminal procedure, though it is that. It is a story about what happens when warnings go unheeded long enough to become tragedies. When a woman says she is afraid, and the fear turns out to have been right, and the outcome is 2 children in an upstairs room, crying in a house that no longer holds the people who were supposed to come. Story 2. There is a particular kind of beauty in the way a photographer sees the world, not just the flat image at the end of a lens, but the light that bends around corners, the emotion that pools in a stranger's eyes, the stories that exist in shadows. Joe Shymansky had that kind of vision. He had built his life around it, and it had given him everything he loved, a career, a community, and 2 small children who called him Dad, and made every morning worth waking up for. In September 2023, on a warm Labor Day weekend, that life was extinguished in the driveway of his own home by a man he had never once met. Joe Shymansky arrived in Washington, D.C., in the early 2000s with a teacher's heart and an artist's soul. He came to teach middle school history and social studies, bringing curiosity and warmth into classrooms full of children who needed someone to show them that the world was larger than their block. It was in that city, vibrant, restless, and full of contradiction, that Joe found his second calling. He discovered photography, and the camera became a second language, one he spoke with uncommon fluency. He set up a photography business at Eastern Market, one of DC's most storied public spaces, a place where neighborhood life hummed with noise and color on weekend mornings. His best friend Alton McDougall, whom Joe had met shortly after arriving in the city, became his business partner. To hear McDougall speak about Joe is to understand the kind of person Joe was, not just a talented artist, but a genuinely generous human being. He was a person that would give you his shirt off his back, even in a rainstorm, McDougall would later say. It was at Eastern Market that Joe met Heather Snyder. She was a single mother of 3, running a vegetable stand with practicality and independence. He was charming and full of life. Their romance bloomed in the middle of that public square, and in July 2014 they married. They bought a house in the rural expanse of Calvert County, Maryland, surrounded by trees, wide yards, and neighbors who looked out for one another. A daughter and a son followed within the next year, and for a time, their world seemed complete. But by 2020, the cracks had grown too wide to paper over. Friends and family close to Joe spoke of financial strain, of arguments that grew louder, of an imbalance that had been there almost from the beginning. Joe had reportedly written Heather checks to cover debts on a house she owned, and had given her money to launch a new business. Alton McDougall had watched with concern for years. Heather, for her part, would later say Joe had become emotionally consumed by his children to the exclusion of everything else, and that she had experienced his behavior as controlling and frightening. The truth of a marriage, of course, lives in the space between 2 competing accounts. What was undeniable was that by 2021, Heather had left. She moved back to her hometown of Newport, Pennsylvania, and a contentious, exhausting divorce process began. The court finalized the divorce in October 2022, granting Joe primary physical custody of their daughter and son during the school year, with holidays and most of the summer reserved for Heather in Pennsylvania. Joe had fought hard for that arrangement, not out of malice, but because he believed to his core that stability and continuity were what his children needed most. While Joe was rebuilding his life piece by careful piece, Heather had moved on romantically. Sometime around late 2021 or early 2022, she began seeing a man named Brandon Ross Holbrook, who lived near her in rural Pennsylvania. Joe was never introduced to Holbrook. The 2 men had never spoken, never exchanged a text message, never stood within 100 miles of each other with any awareness of the other's presence. Yet their lives were about to become fatally entangled. Holbrook was a man with a long and deeply troubling history. Over the years, he had pleaded guilty to at least 5 counts of indecent exposure involving public lewd conduct, incidents spanning gyms, libraries, retail stores, and even the hospital where he had once worked as a nurse. He was not a stranger to the criminal justice system, and authorities in his area of Pennsylvania had encountered him before. Just a month before the murder, in August 2023, he was arrested again for similar conduct at a fitness gym. Despite knowing all of this, Heather allowed Holbrook into her home, where her children, including Joe's 2 young kids during their summer visits, came to know him as Uncle Brandon. Joe was never told about Holbrook's criminal background. He had no way of knowing that a man with this history had access to his children. At some point during that brutal custody dispute, something inside Brandon Holbrook shifted. Text messages that would later surface during the trial painted a picture of a man growing increasingly invested and increasingly dangerous. In January 2023, 8 months before the murder, Heather had texted Holbrook complaining about Joe, describing the emotional toll of the ongoing fight. Holbrook's response was chilling in its casual menace. "I have other solutions in mind," he wrote, "but probably not the best way to go." Heather, in the text that followed, told him she was looking for a therapist. She would later say she took Holbrook's words as a joke. But those 4 words, "I have other solutions in mind," would echo through a courtroom 2 years later, and no one who heard them would find them remotely funny. Sunday, September 3rd, 2023 was a Labor Day weekend afternoon in Calvert County, Maryland. The kind of late summer day when the light comes in warm and golden and everything feels suspended on the edge of a seasonal change. Joe Shymansky had spent the afternoon next door, helping his neighbor Colton Poundsbury with a drywall project. It was ordinary and neighborly, just a man helping a friend. By around 4 p.m., he walked back home. Around that same time, in the wooded sprawl of rural Pennsylvania, Brandon Holbrook climbed into his white pickup truck and began driving. He had more than 200 miles ahead of him. Sometime after Joe returned to his house, neighbors in the area heard gunshots. Target shooting was not unusual in the neighborhood. Houses were spread far apart with limited sight lines, and the sound of a firearm was not, by itself, alarming. Nobody called anything in. Nobody checked. The afternoon wound down, and the sun began its slow decline toward the tree line. Meanwhile, a man returned to his truck with a body. He drove through the evening, across 2 state lines, back to Pennsylvania, carrying with him the proof of what he had done. Joe Shymansky's flip-flops were found just inside his front door. His car keys, wallet, and phone were left inside the house. He had come home, set things down, and stepped outside, perhaps to check the yard, perhaps at the sound of an unfamiliar vehicle in his driveway. Whatever had drawn him out to that open patch of concrete, he never made it back through his door. Labor Day Monday, September 4th, 2023, 7:47 in the evening. Calvert County Sheriff's deputies were called to Joe Shymansky's home after his ex-wife Heather Snyder arrived to drop off their children for the school year. Under a new court order that required her to make the full drive to Joe's house rather than meeting halfway, a change pushed through by Joe's new attorney just weeks prior. When Heather arrived, Joe wasn't there. His car was in the driveway. The house was dark. She knocked on the neighbor's door, Allison and Colton Poundsbury, who said they had last seen Joe the afternoon before, around 4 o'clock, when they'd shared dinner after the drywall work. "We gave him some dinner," Colton told the deputies. Nobody had seen him since. Heather Snyder called 911. Officers searched the property in the dark, and using a drone, they combed the surrounding area. Nothing was found that night. It was too dark to see what daylight would make unmistakably clear. The next morning, September 5th, investigators returned to Joe's property. In the thin Maryland morning light, they found what they had missed: bloodstains in the driveway. Human blood, stark on the concrete. The case immediately shifted from a missing persons situation to something far darker. Investigators interviewed Heather at the station. She told them she had no idea what had happened. They asked if Joe had any enemies. "No," she said. They asked if she was in a relationship. "No," she said, then added that she had briefly dated someone but had ended it. His name, she told them, was Brandon Holbrook. That name, offered quietly, almost as an afterthought, would change everything. Police ran Holbrook's vehicle registration and checked the area's license plate recognition data. What they found sent a pulse of cold certainty through the investigation. Holbrook's white pickup truck had been captured by a plate reader in Calvert County, Maryland, on September 3rd, the same day Joe Shymansky vanished. On the evening of September 5th, Mifflin County, Pennsylvania Police Sergeant John Chester received a call from Maryland investigators. They were looking for a person of interest in a homicide. They had an address in Reedsville, Pennsylvania, and a name: Brandon Holbrook. Chester knew the name. "We've arrested Mr. Holbrook in the past," he said. Officers approached Holbrook's property late that night. The scene that greeted them was unsettling before they had even opened a door. The covered bed of Holbrook's pickup truck sat in the driveway, and officers immediately noticed a smell, raw and heavy and unmistakable. "This truck reeks," Chester said. It smelled like death. Holbrook denied everything. He said he had never been to Maryland. He denied any contact with Joe Shymansky. He offered an explanation for the smell. He worked as a driver for a plant that processed chicken slaughterhouse waste. Officers noted his eyes were bloodshot, that he appeared nervous, and that he was not being entirely truthful. In the early morning hours of September 6th, 2023, Brandon Holbrook was arrested and charged with the murder of Joe Shymansky. What investigators found over the next several days was almost beyond comprehension. In Holbrook's garage, a tool case sat open beside an open package of power saw blades. In a trailer outside the house, there were plastic garbage bags, bleach, Lysol, and tools that were still wet. In the truck cab, there were gloves and plastic sheeting. Cadaver dogs followed a dirt road from behind Holbrook's house into the woods, toward a creek. In a clearing by the water, they made a grisly discovery: a jawbone, pieces of an ear, teeth still intact. A burned barrel nearby smelled of decomposition. Piles of ash lay scattered in the grass. In mid-September 2023, forensic experts made the confirmation that Joe's family had been dreading. The remains matched Joe Shymansky. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. The manner of death, homicide. Security camera footage surfaced showing Holbrook at a nearby Weiss market the morning after the murder, purchasing cleaning supplies. Another video, difficult to make out clearly, appeared to show him near his truck, dumping something in a grassy area, what turned out to be burned human remains. Joe Shymansky, who had once taught children how to see the world and had shared his art with thousands of people in one of America's most vibrant cities, had been shot in his own driveway, his body driven across state lines, and destroyed in a clearing in the Pennsylvania woods. For Joe's family and friends, the grief was immeasurable, but so was the confusion. Brandon Holbrook had never met Joe Shymansky. He had no personal grievance with him, no history with him, no business with him whatsoever. Yet he had driven over 200 miles, shot him in broad daylight, and then methodically attempted to erase every trace of the crime. The only thing connecting Brandon Holbrook to Joe Shymansky was Heather Snyder. Mary Shymansky, Joe's sister, said plainly what many in the family believed. "I do not believe that Brandon Holbrook is the only person involved in my brother's death." Alton McDougal, Joe's oldest friend and business partner, wept when he spoke to reporters about a conversation he had had with Joe just days before the murder, when he had learned that Heather was coming all the way to Joe's house for the first time. McDougal told Joe he didn't trust it. Joe had dismissed his concern. "I get chills right now," McDougal said, voice breaking. "He might still be here." The text messages that emerged during the investigation did little to quiet the suspicion. 6 days before the murder, Holbrook had texted Heather that he liked the smell of your hair on my pillow. She had responded, "Wish I was in your bed." She had told police she had ended the relationship a month earlier. In another text, she wrote about Joe, "I keep thinking karma is going to catch up with him, but I'm tired of being patient." And yet, Heather Snyder had an alibi. Surveillance footage placed her at a pizza place in Pennsylvania, roughly 3 hours from Joe's house. During the afternoon, he disappeared. She could not have physically pulled the trigger. What she knew, or suspected, or encouraged, or failed to discourage, remained and continues to remain an open and agonizing question. When called as a witness at trial, Heather Snyder invoked her Fifth Amendment right and refused to answer a single question under oath. The trial of Brandon Holbrook began on March 31st, 2025, in a Maryland courtroom. Prosecutors painted a meticulous picture of premeditated murder. The truck near Joe's house, the shopping for cleaning supplies the next morning, the video of a man dumping burned human remains, the saw blades and bleach and plastic bags. They argued that Holbrook had acted out of obsessive devotion to Heather Snyder, driven by months of her complaints about Joe, and inflamed by a burning need to make her problem go away. The defense team tried to shift the lens toward Heather Snyder. Her name was mentioned more than 400 times during the trial. Defense attorney Brendan Callahan pointed to the life insurance policy. Joe had taken out a $1 million policy just 4 months before his death, naming his children as beneficiaries, and argued that Heather, as the parent who would control access to that money while the children were minors, had far more to gain from Joe's death than Holbrook ever did. The motives write themselves, Callahan told the jury. There were inconvenient gaps in the prosecution's case, and the defense exploited every one of them. No murder weapon was ever found. No DNA of Joe Shymansky was recovered on Holbrook's property itself. The blood found in the truck bed tested as animal blood, consistent with Holbrook's job transporting chicken waste. Holbrook's phone, records showed, had pinged only towers near his Pennsylvania home during the afternoon and evening Joe disappeared. The camera images of his truck near Joe's house had not been clear enough to identify the driver. But the jury was not uncertain. After just 80 minutes of deliberation, they returned a verdict on April 9, 2025. Brandon Holbrook was guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, use of a firearm in the commission of a violent crime, and destruction and concealment of physical evidence. When the verdict was read aloud, Joe's sister Janine Shymansky exhaled two words that held years of grief and waiting. Extremely happy. On July 18, 2025, before a courtroom filled with Joe's friends and family, the judge sentenced Brandon Holbrook to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge made clear, as he closed the proceedings, that he was not closing the book on the case. When the sentencing was over, Joe's friend Anneli Werner stood before the court and played a photo montage of Joe, the man behind the camera, the laughing father, the patient teacher. She also played audio recordings Joe had made, recordings meant for his children's ears one day, his voice full of the complicated hope of a parent trying to protect children he adored and feared losing. A scholarship has since been established in Joe Shymansky's name for photography students in Washington, D.C., public high schools. A small but enduring act of tribute to a man who believed that learning to see through a lens was one of the most transformative things a young person could do. Brandon Holbrook, sitting in a cell, has continued to deny that he ever saw, spoke to, or interacted with Joe Shymansky, even in a recorded phone call from jail, even while facing the rest of his natural life behind bars. He is currently appealing his conviction. He has never explained why he drove to Maryland that September afternoon. He has never said where the gun went. He has never told anyone, at least not on a recorded line, what actually happened in that driveway. Heather Snyder maintains her innocence. She has said she was blindsided, that she never asked Holbrook to hurt Joe, that she grieves the loss of her children's father. She has said she is raising their two children, trying to honor Joe's memory for them. She has said she is not worried at all that authorities will come for her. The detective who investigated the case, Jessica Orand, was asked directly whether Heather Snyder was involved in the crime. "I can't answer that question," she said. She was asked whether she knew the answer. She said yes. She said she was not allowed to say. And somewhere in the quiet of Calvert County, Maryland, the driveway where Joe Shymansky spent his last moments still catches the afternoon light the same way it always has. His car is gone now. His flip-flops are gone. The children who were supposed to come home to him that Labor Day weekend are growing up somewhere in Pennsylvania, without their father, carrying in their memories the image of a man who loved them with an almost fierce completeness, and who, by all accounts, never had a single enemy in the world except for the one that Heather Snyder's life had quietly, invisibly, delivered to his door. The case of Joe Shymansky remains, in its deepest dimensions, unresolved. One man has been convicted and imprisoned for life. Another name, one that hung over every moment of the trial, has never been charged. The truth of what was planned, what was spoken, and what was known in the days before September 3rd, 2023, may never be fully told. For Joe's family and friends, justice arrived, and it was not enough. It never quite is. Story 3. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not only from losing someone you love, but from realizing that the danger was invisible until it was too late. That the very moment you thought the worst was over was the moment the worst had only just begun. The story of Katie Fusco is that kind of story. It is a story about a young woman full of creativity and quiet hope, about a family that opened its arms wide enough to hold her, and about a darkness that crept into her life wearing the disguise of something she had always longed for, the chance to know where she came from. To understand Katie, you must first understand the beginning she was never meant to remember. In 1995, a 20-year-old man named Stephen Walter Plattle discovered the internet at a time when very few people truly understood what it could become or how it could be weaponized. Born in Levittown, New York on April 6, 1975, Stephen was by most accounts a strange and solitary figure. Classmates recalled that he rarely socialized, wore the same clothes to school day after day, and seemed to exist at the margins of every room he entered. Whatever was happening inside Stephen Plattle's mind remained largely hidden behind that blank, watchful exterior. Through the internet, Stephen found Alyssa Garcia, a 15-year-old girl living in San Antonio, Texas. He was 20, The relationship that followed was not a romance between equals, it was grooming. Stephen traveled to San Antonio and drew Alyssa into a relationship, and she, still a teenager, ran away with him to New York. She became pregnant at 16. On January 29, 1998, Alyssa gave birth to a little girl. They named her Denise. But the joy of new life was immediately shadowed by fear. Alyssa would later describe a man whose moods could turn without warning, whose anger filled every room like a cold front rolling in off the water. She said Stephen pinched the baby, their newborn daughter, until her tiny body was black and blue. She described him stuffing the infant into a cooler to the point of near suffocation. Alyssa was barely a child herself, terrified and isolated, but she made one decision that would define the rest of her daughter's life. She chose to give her up. It was so hard to give her up, Alyssa later said. But I had to, because I wanted her to live and be happy. When Denise was 8 months old, she was placed for adoption. The couple who adopted her were Tony and Katie Fusco, a warm and steady pair from Dover, New York, a small town nestled in the hills about 80 miles north of New York City. Tony was a retired corrections officer from the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, a man who spent his career surrounded by the worst that people could do to each other, and still came home every evening to a family he clearly treasured. Kelly, born with the last name Gould, came from a close-knit family where showing up for one another was simply the way things were done. They renamed their new daughter Katie Rose Fusco, and they raised her alongside their biological daughter in a life that, by every account, was defined by ordinary and beautiful normalcy. Katie's uncle Cary Gould, Kelly's brother, would later speak about her with unmistakable warmth. He remembered her appetite. His nickname for her was Pac-Man because she was always eating, and her love of animals. She became a vegetarian. She spent hours bent over sketchbooks, filling page after page with comic strips and drawings. A pen and something to draw on became a safe place for me, Katie once wrote in a personal blog post. Ink became my weapon against rules and regulations. To be short, for me a life without art is no life at all. She graduated from Dover High School in 2016 with plans to attend Dutchess Community College to study art and pursue a career in digital advertising. She was creative, she was curious, and she was, by all descriptions, a young woman on the threshold of the life she had been building toward. She had been told at some point that she was adopted, and now, at 18, she had begun to wonder about the people who had given her up. In August 2016, Katie did what so many young people of her generation do. She searched for her biological family on Facebook. She found Stephen and Alyssa Plattel, sent them a message, and the reunion was set in motion. Whatever she imagined about her birth parents in the weeks before that meeting, whatever story she had written in her mind about who they were and why they had given her away, the reality was something she could not possibly have prepared for. Instead of enrolling in college that fall, Katie made a decision that her adoptive parents quietly supported even as it filled them with unease. She moved in with the Plattels in their home in unincorporated Henrico County, Virginia, near Richmond. Tony and Katie Fusco were apprehensive, deeply so, but Katie was 18 and legally an adult, and they believed, as loving parents often must, that supporting her choice was better than driving her away. What Katie did not know, what no one had told her clearly enough, was that the household she was walking into was already fracturing. Stephen and Alyssa Plattel had privately decided to separate and were sleeping in separate rooms by the time Katie arrived. And the man she was moving in with had a history of explosive behavior, emotional and verbal abuse, and owned at least 4 guns. Alyssa Plattel had tried to warn Katie. She told her privately that Stephen had abused her as an infant and that Katie's safety had been a reason for the adoption. According to Alyssa, Katie didn't seem concerned. Within weeks of Katie's arrival, something shifted in Stephen Plattel in a way that disturbed everyone who noticed it. He began wearing skinny jeans and form-fitting shirts. He shaved his beard. He let his hair grow long. He became attentive and present in a way he had never been before in the years Alyssa had known him. Then, about 6 weeks after Katie moved in, he began sleeping on the floor of her bedroom. Alyssa was immediately alarmed. When it happened a second night, she confronted him directly. Stephen's response was not shame or explanation. He told her it was none of her business, grabbed his things, and walked out of the house with Katie at his side. Alyssa Plattle moved out in November 2016. She and Stephen agreed to shared custody of their 2 younger children. Whatever hope she may have held that the household would stabilize without her presence was gone. 6 months passed. Then, in May 2017, Alyssa made a discovery that shattered her. While reading the journal of her 11-year-old daughter, she came across entries that described the unthinkable. Stephen and Katie were in a sexual relationship. Katie was pregnant. The children in the house had been told to refer to Katie as their stepmother. Alyssa called Stephen immediately. His response was chilling in its casualness. "I thought you knew," he told her. "We're in love." Alyssa started screaming. She demanded to know how he could have done this, reminding him that Katie was his daughter, that she had been a baby when they gave her up, that none of this was something love could justify or excuse. Then she called the police. A criminal investigation was opened. But life, with its terrible momentum, did not pause while the authorities worked. On July 20th, 2017, just 2 months after Alyssa reported the relationship, and while a police investigation was actively underway, Stephen Plattle married Katie in Parkton, Maryland. They lied on the marriage application, writing that they were not related by blood. The wedding was small. Stephen's mother was there, and so were Katie's adoptive parents, Tony and Kelly Fusco, who had come to believe there was nothing more they could do to stop what was happening, and that the only way to remain in their daughter's life was to stand at her side and keep the door open. In a photograph from that day, Katie stands in a short black dress. She is smiling. On September 1st, 2017, Katie gave birth to a boy. They named him Bennett Curran Plattle. He was both Stephen's son and his grandson, a detail so terrible in its geometry that most people, when confronted with it, struggle to hold it steady in their minds. He was also Katie's son and her half-brother. He was 7 pounds of absolute innocence, carrying in his small body no knowledge of the circumstances that had produced him. In January 2018, police arrested both Stephen and Katie on incest charges in Wake County, North Carolina. The charges included incest with an adult, adultery, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Stephen was released on bond. Katie, who was 20 years old, remained in custody until her trial. By early February, the story had spread across the country and around the world, drawing the kind of appalled, bewildered attention that accompanies crimes that seem to break some fundamental law of human nature. Both were extradited to Virginia to face trial. Stephen's attorney, Rick Friedman II, argued that his client's relationship with Katie had been entirely consensual. He described Stephen as head over heels in love with his daughter and suggested that this love had outweighed the issue of them being biologically related. He pointed to Stephen's troubled marriage and his personal difficulties as context. The judge ordered that Stephen and Katie have no further contact with each other. Custody of baby Bennett was transferred to Stephen's mother in Knightdale, North Carolina. Both were released on bond. Katie went home to Tony and Kelly Fusco in Dover, New York. She was back in the bedroom where she had grown up, in the house where she had drawn comic strips and filled sketchbooks, in the arms of the people who had chosen her and raised her and never stopped loving her. And from the safety of that home, she made a phone call to Stephen Plattle. She told him she was done. She did not want to continue their relationship. Whatever her feelings had been, whatever confusion or manipulation had shaped the previous 2 years of her life, she was walking away. The phone call left Stephen Plattle, by all accounts, enraged. April 11th, 2018 was a Wednesday. In Knightdale, North Carolina, in the home where his mother was caring for baby Bennett, Stephen Plattle committed an act of violence against the most defenseless person in his world. He smothered his 7-month-old son, the child who was also his grandson, and hid the infant's small body in a closet. The details of what Bennett's final moments were like are not something any of us can know. He was 7 months old. He could not have understood what was happening. He had barely begun. A welfare check the following morning, April 12th, would discover him at 9 a.m., motionless and alone in that closet, the key to the house left under the mat, as though even the logistics of what came next had been carefully arranged. Stephen Plattle had not finished. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Katie and her adoptive father Tony made the same drive from Dover, New York, to Waterbury, Connecticut, to visit Katie's adoptive grandmother and help clean her house. It was a routine, comfortable and predictable, the kind of small domestic rhythm that gives ordinary days their shape. Stephen Plattle knew about this routine. On the morning of April 12, 2018, surveillance cameras captured something chilling. A minivan was parked near the Fusco home in Dover. Inside it, still and watchful, sat Stephen Plattle. He watched as Katie and Tony climbed into their vehicle and pulled out of the driveway. Then he followed them. The drive from Dover toward Waterbury takes travelers through the quiet hills and winding roads of Connecticut. On Route 7, the landscape is green and unhurried, the kind of scenery that makes you forget, for a moment, that the world can be a dangerous place. At the intersection of Route 7 and Route 55, in New Milford, Connecticut, Katie and Tony's vehicle came to a stop at a stop sign. Stephen Plattle's minivan pulled alongside them. Witnesses nearby heard what came next, a rapid, terrible sequence of gunshots. Investigators would later determine that Stephen had fired an Arrow AR-15 style rifle multiple times into the passenger side of the vehicle, striking both Katie and Tony with numerous gunshot wounds to their upper bodies and heads. The floor of the car was littered with spent casings. The attack was not a moment of panic or accident. It was deliberate and overwhelming. Police and emergency services arrived to find Katie Rose Fusco Plattle, 20 years old, and Anthony Charles Fusco, 56 years old, dead in their car. Bystanders stood at the edges of the scene, stunned, trying to reconcile the tranquil Connecticut road with the violence that had just torn it apart. Stephen Plattle drove back toward Dover. At some point during that drive, he called his mother. In a voice that investigators would later describe as disturbingly calm, he told her what he had done. He had killed Bennett. He had killed Katie. He had killed Tony. He told her not to go into the house. He told her to call the police. He told her there was a key under the mat. His mother, upon hearing her son's words, became hysterical. The 911 call she made shortly after has been described by those who have heard it as one of the most harrowing recordings in the case. "He left the baby dead," she told the dispatcher, her voice barely holding together. "He told me to call the police, and I shouldn't go over there." She explained that her son had been devastated because Katie had broken up with him the day before. Police launched an hours-long search for Stephen Plattle throughout Dutchess County. They found him 18 miles from where he had shot Katie and Tony, inside his van back in Dover. He was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. 3 people were buried together at St. Charles Cemetery in Dover Plains, New York. Katie Rose Fusco, 20 years old, who had wanted to be an artist. Anthony Charles Fusco, 56 years old, the father who had driven to be with his daughter on an ordinary Thursday morning, and Bennett Curran Plattle, 7 months old, who had never been given the chance to become anything at all. Their neighbor, Shirley Mann, spoke to reporters in the days after. "We're all still in shock," she said. "It's crazy. I don't know what else to say. It's horrible." Alyssa Plattle, the woman who had once been a 15-year-old girl swept away by a man who would eventually destroy her family across 2 decades, spoke with a grief that held both devastation and a fierce, burning desire to make meaning out of the senseless. "I'm grieving," she said. "I'm sad. I'm upset. But I also want to have something good come out of this. If it's to get truth out there, to open people's eyes to incest." Stephen's attorney, Rick Friedman, too, told the press that nobody ever could have predicted what his client had done, and that during their meetings, Stephen had shown no indication of violence. But critics of the case pointed to what the record clearly showed: a man with a documented history of abuse, a man who had groomed a 15-year-old girl as a young adult and later manipulated his own biological daughter, a man who owned at least 4 guns and had a volatile temper, and a legal system that had weighed all of this and released him on bond anyway, without adequately protecting the people most at risk. The story, at its heart, belongs to Katie. It belongs to a girl who was given up in an act of desperate love, who was raised in a home full of warmth and art and animals, who spent her childhood finding safety in a sketchbook, who turned 18 and did what any young person might do, reached toward the part of herself she had never known. She could not have known what was waiting for her on the other side of that Facebook search. She could not have known that the man she was looking for had been dangerous long before she was born, and that the danger had never left him. She was 20 years old when she died, still young enough that the life she had imagined, the digital advertising career, the sketchbooks, the ink as a weapon against the ordinary, was almost entirely ahead of her. The Fuscos of Dover had given her everything they had. On the last morning of her life, her father was beside her in the car, as fathers are, driving with her toward a Thursday routine, the radio perhaps on, the Connecticut hills green outside the windows, neither of them knowing that the minivan behind them carried the end of everything. Katie Rose Fusco deserved the life that was stolen from her. The art she never made, the mornings she never woke to, the peace she was finally, briefly beginning to reach. All of it gone at an intersection on a quiet road, on an ordinary spring morning, in the kind of place where terrible things are never supposed to happen. Story 4. There is a particular quality to silence in the Karoo, the vast, semi-arid heartland of South Africa's northern Cape. It is not the silence of emptiness, but of distance, of earth so wide and flat and ancient that sound itself seems reluctant to travel across it. In the small farming town of Griquastad, nestled in that enormous stillness, the people who lived there had long made peace with the quietness. Farmers and their families woke before dawn, worked the red soil until their hands were cracked and brown, attended church on Sundays, and kept their doors unlocked because there were no strangers here, only neighbors, cousins, and old friends whose grandparents had built the same land beside their own grandparents. It was that kind of town, the kind of town where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. On Good Friday, the 6th of April, 2012, something truly terrible happened. To understand what was lost that evening, you must first understand what existed. The Steenkamp family were not simply residents of Griquastad. They were, in many ways, woven into its fabric. Dion Steenkamp was 44 years old, a man who came from a long line of farmers, the kind of person who understood the northern Cape soil the way others understand music or mathematics, intuitively, completely. He was known throughout the region as dependable and hard-working, the kind of farmer whose quiet competence earned the respect of everyone around him. His wife, Crystal, was warm and deeply devoted to their children, holding the household together with the particular grace of a woman who rarely made a fuss about how much she carried. Together, they ran Nahauk Farm, a sprawling property outside of town that had been in the family for generations. Their 2 children completed the picture. Marthella was a teenager, bright and full of the particular energy of a young person on the edge of her own story, still becoming someone, still writing the first pages of an adult life she would never get to finish. And then there was Don. Don Steenkamp was 15 years old in April 2012, and to the entire community of Griquastad, he was the embodiment of a certain kind of Karoo pride. He was a national tent-pegging champion, an equestrian discipline that demands extraordinary skill, nerve, and coordination, competing on a level that few young men ever reached. He attended Grey College in Bloemfontein, one of South Africa's most respected schools, making the long commute between the city and his rural home. He was known as a churchgoer, a responsible young man, a boy his parents could speak of with undisguised pride. Nobody in Griquastad had any reason to look at the Steenkamp family and see anything other than what they appeared to be. A close, prosperous, well-liked farming family, anchored to their land and their community, surrounded by people who cared for them. The 5th of April, 2012, the Thursday before Easter, passed without any outward sign of what was building beneath the surface of the Nahauk farmhouse. Families across South Africa were preparing for the long holiday weekend. Churches were being readied for Good Friday services. Children were home from school. Bray fires would be lit across 1,000 farms, and families would gather around them in that particular South African way, eating, arguing gently, laughing at old stories. What happened inside the Steenkamp home that Thursday night has never been fully confessed, never narrated in full by the one person who lived through it. What forensic evidence would later confirm, and what a court of law would eventually accept as proven fact, was this. In the darkness of that Thursday night, Don Steenkamp physically assaulted his sister, Marthella. It was a violation so profound, so shattering of the intimate trust that holds a family together, that its aftermath demanded either confession or concealment. Don Steenkamp chose concealment, with a completeness that could not have been achieved with words alone. April 6, 2012 was Good Friday, the day on the Christian calendar set aside to reflect on sacrifice and suffering. In Griquastad, as in communities across South Africa, it was a day of quiet observance, of family, of a peculiar holy stillness. The sky above the Northern Cape would have been its trademark burning blue, the flat landscape shimmering in the autumn afternoon heat that still clings to that part of the country well into April. In the late afternoon or early evening of Good Friday, Don Steenkamp moved through the Nahouk farmhouse with 2 firearms, a revolver and a rifle, both of which were legally stored on the property. He first used the revolver to incapacitate the members of his family, shooting each of them at close range before following up with the rifle to deliver fatal shots to their heads. The attack is exhibiting overkill, a clinical term for violence far in excess of what was required to cause death, suggesting a deliberate, sustained, and deeply personal ferocity. The victims had additionally been struck with enough force to split their scalps, the weapons used as blunt objects as well as firearms. Dion Steenkamp, the father, was shot 3 times, once in the right shoulder, once behind the ear, and once in the chest. Evidence suggested he had lunged toward the attacker, perhaps in a desperate and final attempt to protect his family. Crystal, his wife, was shot in the shoulder, neck, and back, the trajectory of the wounds suggesting she was shot from behind, perhaps as she tried to move away. Marthella tried to run. She made it out of the immediate area of the attack, her young legs carrying her with whatever desperate strength remained, but she did not make it far. She was shot, fell, and then, in a detail that has never left those who followed this case, she crawled. Even wounded, even dying, Marthella Steenkamp crawled back toward the house, toward the hope of a telephone, of help, of someone who might save her. Nobody came. The rifle was fired again, and then again. She was only a teenager. When the silence returned to Nahouk Farm, it was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded it. 3 people were dead. The television was still on inside the house. Just before 7 o'clock in the evening, the quiet of the Griquastad police station was shattered by the arrival of a white Isuzu Bakkie, a utility vehicle, the backbone of South African farm life, that skidded to a stop in front of the building. A young man leapt out of the driver's side and ran inside. He was covered in blood. He fell to his knees in the charge office and cried out, "You must come. They've been shot. They are all dead." It was Don Steenkamp. He told the officers who rushed toward him that there had been a farm invasion, that while he had been in the barn, armed attackers had broken into the house and murdered his parents and his sister. He was 15 years old, soaked in blood, visibly distressed, and describing every parent's and every farmer's worst nightmare in South Africa's countryside. The farm attack, the brutal and senseless violence that had haunted rural communities for decades. Officers at the station responded immediately. The scene at Nahouk was exactly as Don had described. 3 bodies, 3 family members, shot multiple times, blood across the floors of the home they had built their lives in. It was devastating and it was horrifying, and, in those first terrible hours, it was completely consistent with the kind of farm attack that South African police had been called to document too many times in too many years. The investigation opened as a triple murder in a suspected home invasion. Don Steenkamp was a grieving survivor. And for the next several weeks, that was the story everyone believed. In the days and weeks that followed, grief moved through Griquastad like weather. The Steenkamp family was mourned genuinely, deeply, and publicly. This was a community that knew them, respected them, and felt the loss as something communal. Don, having provided his account to police, was surrounded by friends and family. He was granted bail as the investigation continued. To those watching him, something was not quite right. He continued attending national Gymkhana equestrian tournaments, competing with the same controlled precision that had always defined him as a rider. He rode his dead sister Marthella's horse. He socialized, maintained a calm exterior, and spoke about the murders when asked with a composure that a 15-year-old boy who had just watched his entire family be killed might not have been expected to possess. The community was split. Some attributed this to shock, to the particular numbness that sometimes follows catastrophic loss. Others felt something they could not name, a wrongness at the edges of everything Don said and did. Meanwhile, Brigadier Dick Duvall, the investigating officer who would come to dedicate years of his professional life to this case, was looking closely at the physical evidence and finding details that did not align with Don's account. There had been no signs of forced entry at the farmhouse, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors, no evidence that anyone from outside had breached the property with violence. Nothing of significant value appeared to have been taken. And there was the matter of the firearms. The weapons used in the attack had been secured in a safe in the bedroom, which meant that whoever accessed them had known exactly where they were, and had access to the combination or key. The profile of a random farm invasion was dissolving. In its place, a profile far more disturbing was assembling itself from the evidence. 4 months after the murders, in August 2012, Don Steenkamp was arrested. He was charged with 3 counts of murder, the murders of his father, his mother, and his sister, as well as rape and defeating the ends of justice. He was 15 years old. Because Don had been 15 at the time of the murders, the South African legal system processed his case through a youth court, with all the particular protocols and protections that the law affords to children accused of serious crimes. He could not be named publicly. The proceedings were shielded from full media access. But in a case this large, in a community this small, secrecy was largely theoretical. Everyone in Griquastad and beyond already knew exactly who stood accused. The trial that unfolded over the next 2 years was extraordinary, not just in the horror of its subject matter, but in the portrait it drew of a young man who seemed to inhabit a space entirely beyond ordinary emotional reach. Don Steenkamp took the stand and proved to be, as Judge President Franz Como would eventually describe him, an evasive and deliberate liar who had set about misleading the police and the court with remarkable consistency. He was not nervous. He did not waver or crumble under cross-examination. He did not weep. He answered questions about the deaths of his parents and his sister with a control and a precision that left experienced legal professionals visibly unsettled. When prosecution caught him in a contradiction, he adapted. When evidence cornered him, he offered alternate explanations. He was at 15 and then 16 and then 17, more composed in a murder trial than many adults managed to be when called to testify about far less serious matters. The forensic evidence told its own story, independent of Don's narration. The ballistic expert confirmed that all 3 victims had been shot by both the revolver and the rifle, first wounded, then killed. The trajectory of the wounds in each body mapped a sequence of deliberate, methodical violence. The absence of gunpowder residue on Don's hands was noted by the defense as potentially exculpatory. The prosecution countered that if he had washed or changed clothing, residue could have been removed. Critically, traces were found on both shirts he was alleged to have worn that day. GPS data from a tracking device was introduced as evidence. Investigators had retraced Don's alleged movements on the evening using the GPS record and found multiple discrepancies between what the data showed and what Don had told police. The timing of his arrival at the police station, the route taken, the account of where he was when the attack supposedly occurred, none of it mapped cleanly onto the evidence. And then there was the question of motive. The most haunting element of the entire case, the detail that reframed everything, was the rape of Marthella the night before. 2 doctors testified to the physical evidence of sexual assault. The court accepted their expert findings. In the prosecution's framing, and in the judge's eventual ruling, the murders were not random violence, and they were not the act of invaders. They were concealment. Dion and Crystal Steenkamp had died because they were the parents of a daughter who had been violated, and their son could not allow that to be known. They had died because they were witnesses. And Marthella had died because she was the only one who truly knew what had happened in the dark of that Thursday night. One of the most chilling moments of the entire trial was reported by police officers who were present when news of Don's arrest was first broadcast on the radio. Several officers independently testified that at the moment the news broke, Don Steenkamp smiled. Not a grimace, not a startled expression of recognition, a smile. Judge President Franz Como delivered his verdict in November 2014, more than 2 years after the murders. He found Don Steenkamp guilty on all counts: 3 counts of murder, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of defeating the ends of justice. In his judgment, Como described Don as a deliberate deceiver, a young man who had constructed a false narrative and maintained it across years of investigation and trial with a discipline that most adults could not match. The sentence, handed down after conviction, was 20 years effective, the maximum possible sentence for a person who had been a child at the time of the offense. He would serve this sentence in a correctional facility, eligible for parole review after a portion of the time had been served. For the community of Griquastad, the verdict brought something that could not quite be called relief, because relief implies the return of something that was lost, and Dion, Crystal, and Marthella were not coming back. What the verdict brought, perhaps, was the closing of a wound, not its healing, but at least the acknowledgement, by the full weight of the law in the state, that what had happened on Nahauk Farm on Good Friday 2012 was what many had suspected from early in the investigation. Not a farm attack, not random violence, but a calculated slaughter by a person who should have been the last safeguard against any harm coming to those people. The 5 farms held in the Nahauk Trust, the land Dion had worked, the land his family had lived on for generations, were eventually leased to outside farmers. The family estate was largely consumed by the enormous legal costs of the trial. In the place where a family home once stood full of life, someone else now tends the soil. Forensic psychologists and clinical evaluators who assessed Don Steenkamp during the trial and its aftermath produced findings that were deeply troubling. Their reports described what they characterized as emerging psychopathic tendencies, specifically a documented pattern of denial, a capacity for extraordinary violence, and what they called a total void of appropriate emotion. Major Bronwyn Stollers, a forensic expert involved in the case, stated plainly that true rehabilitation was impossible without a genuine admission of guilt, and that without that foundational step, no meaningful transformation could be assessed or verified. In the years since his imprisonment, Don Steenkamp has reportedly offered neither. No confession, no expressed remorse for the deaths of his father, his mother, or his sister. Rumors from within the prison system spoke of arrogance rather than contrition. The boy who rode Marthella's horse in Gymkhana tournaments weeks after her death, the boy who smiled at news of his arrest, the young man who maintained almost supernatural calm throughout a trial for the murder of his entire family. That person, according to those who have monitored his incarceration, has not fundamentally changed. In late 2024 and into 2025, South Africa found itself gripped once more by the Griquastad case when news emerged that Don Steenkamp, by now 29 years old, had been granted parole after serving approximately 11 years of his 20-year effective sentence. The reaction across the Northern Cape and beyond was immediate and visceral. Communities that had spent 12 years trying to recover from the shock of April 2012 found themselves facing the prospect of the man responsible walking free among them. "We are restless," one community member told local media. "It's the whole region. We all remember that time, the fear we felt. The Correctional Services Minister, Peter Greenwald, confirmed that a review was underway. Families of the victims, police officers who had worked the case, and community members all voiced opposition to the release. In September 2024, the parole was denied, for the time being. But the case had reopened, not as a legal proceeding, but as a wound. A reminder that the criminal justice system operates on timelines that grief does not follow, and that the living must continue to contend with decisions made on behalf of people they no longer have any way of consulting. Greekostad is still there. The dust still settles on the same streets in the same way it always has, and the same particular quality of silence still stretches out across the flat northern Cape land in the late afternoons when the heat begins to ease. People still farm the land around Nahauk, still gather in the same church halls, still know each other's names and their children's names and their grandparents' stories. But the name Nahauk carries something different now. It carries the memory of Dion Steenkamp, a farmer who lunged toward danger in a last instinct to protect his family. It carries the memory of Crystal, who died with her back turned to something she never saw coming. It carries the memory of Marthella, a teenage girl who crawled, bleeding, back toward the home she had grown up in, toward the hope that someone might still be there to help her. And it carries the unresolvable reality of Don Steenkamp, a boy who was, by almost every external measure, everything that a community values and a family hopes for, and who carried within him something that no ribbon at a tent-pegging competition, no school uniform, no Sunday morning in a pew had managed to reach or transform. The Greekostad farm murders remain, in the truest sense, a case about the limits of what we can know about the people we are closest to. Dion and Crystal Steenkamp died without ever understanding what had been growing inside their own house, beside them at their dinner table, sleeping under their roof. The community of Greekostad mourned without knowing, for months, who to mourn for and who to fear. South Africa watched a trial unfold that forced a reckoning with a question that has no comfortable answer. What do you do when the monster inside the gates was never a stranger at all? The Karoo holds its silence. The red earth does not give back what it takes. And 3 graves in a farming community in the northern Cape bear witness, as they will for as long as memory survives, to what happened on Good Friday, the 6th of April, 2012, on a farm called Nahauk, in the kind of small town where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. Story 5. There is a particular kind of American dream that takes root in the red Georgia clay, the one where a man builds himself from ambition and intelligence, earns a name that opens doors, raises a family in a house large enough to hold every version of success he ever imagined for himself. Gary Wayne Ferris had that dream, and for a long time, it appeared to be entirely real. He was a prominent commercial real estate attorney in the Atlanta area, the kind of lawyer whose name carried weight in the rooms where serious money moved. He was large in the physical sense, a 300-pound man with the bearing of someone who took up space in a room intentionally, who told stories loudly and laughed fully, and large in the way that some people simply are, filling every space they enter with a presence that cannot be manufactured. He had 4 children, a sprawling 10-acre property on Purcell Lane in Alpharetta, Georgia, and a wife named Melody, whom he had married over 30 years before. He had, by every visible measure, everything. On a July afternoon in 2018, Gary Wayne Ferris was shot in his own basement, his body dragged to a burn pile at the far edge of his property and set on fire. He was 58 years old. It would take a year before anyone was charged, 6 years before anyone stood trial, and 18 days of courtroom testimony before a jury of 12 Georgians returned a verdict that answered the most devastating question of all. Who, among the people Gary had loved and trusted most in the world, had done this to him? Gary Ferris had built his professional life in the competitive and demanding world of commercial real estate law, navigating contracts and transactions that lesser men would have found overwhelming. He was, by all accounts, someone who understood money, how it flowed, how it accumulated, how deals were structured and leverage applied. His success was not theoretical. It was tangible. The sprawling Alpharetta property, the life insurance policy worth $2 million, the law practice that bore his reputation. He was a father of 4. Chris, Scott, Emily, and Amanda. 4 children who had grown up in the orbit of his considerable personality, who knew his voice and his moods and the particular energy of a man who occupied every room he entered. His son Scott, who would later become a central and anguished figure in this story, was close to his father in the complicated way that adult children sometimes are. A relationship built on shared history and occasional financial dependence. The kind of bond that weathers disagreements and loans and tensions without ever quite breaking. His marriage to Melody was a different kind of story. They had been together for more than 3 decades, long enough for every version of themselves to have passed through the life they shared. In 2009, Melody had an affair, a fracture in the marriage that was discovered and never fully repaired. The affair left a wound beneath the surface of the household, invisible on most days but present always, the kind of damage that a couple can paper over with routine and years but never fully close. By 2018, there was a second affair, another revelation that prosecutors would later place at the center of their case, and added to it a growing argument about money. The exact nature of the financial dispute was never made entirely public, but its emotional weight was clear. 2 people who had once chosen each other, now grinding against each other in the private machinery of a marriage that had accumulated too many unresolved grievances to function cleanly. What happened on the evening of July 3, 2018, was the violent end of that long accumulation. The 4th of July is one of the great American celebrations, a holiday built on the idea of fireworks and family, of gathering in the heat of summer with the people you belong to. The Ferris household in Alpharetta was, on the surface, preparing for exactly that kind of weekend. The large property on Purcell Lane had space enough for a family gathering, for the smell of a grill and the sound of children, for all the ordinary rituals that disguise the state of things between 2 people who share a house but not, perhaps, a peace. Gary and Melody had their last known conversation, sometime on the evening of July 3rd. A normal exchange. A few words before Gary went downstairs to his basement bedroom, where he slept alone with his CPAP machine to manage his sleep apnea. It was a detail that, on its own, said something about the architecture of their marriage. 2 people in the same house, sleeping in separate rooms, the distance between them measured in flights of stairs. Scott Ferris had been out with friends that day. He returned to the property around 11:30 that night and noticed, in the darkness beyond the house, an orange glow. It was not unusual to have fires on the property. Farmers and landowners throughout rural Georgia maintained burn piles for clearing brush and debris. Scott noted the glow and went to bed. He did not go to investigate. The next morning, July 4th, Gary Ferris did not appear. There was no smell of coffee, no large presence filling the kitchen. He did not come upstairs. For a household with children moving in and out, a parent's temporary absence can pass for a moment without triggering alarm. The day passed. By July 5th, Gary was still nowhere to be found. His car was on the property. His phone was unanswered. The normalcy of the previous days began to curdle into something else. That particular dread that sets in when the absence of a person starts to feel less like distance and more like disappearance. Scott began searching the property. He walked out toward the far end of the acreage, past the edges of manicured living space, toward the working land beyond. He found the burn pile, a sprawling mound of ash and char, still smoldering in the Georgia summer heat. What he found in that ash was his father. He called 911. His voice, preserved in the recording, carried the kind of shock that cannot be performed. The flat, fractured sound of a person confronting something so far outside of reason that language itself struggles to keep up. "There's human remains in the burn pile," he told the dispatcher. The first responders who arrived at Purcell Lane on July 5th, 2018, were confronted with a scene that was, in its physical reality, almost incomprehensible. A man, enormous in life, 300 pounds of presence, had been reduced to skeletal remains scattered through a burn pile on his own land. The initial assumption, reluctantly considered, was that perhaps Gary had suffered a medical emergency near the pile, had collapsed, and had been caught in the fire accidentally. It was a grim possibility, but a tidier one than the alternative. The forensic team worked through the afternoon and into the evening, sifting through the ash with the methodical patience that this kind of work demands. They cataloged fragments of bone. They documented the arrangement of the remains. And then, in the ruins of what had once been Gary Wayne Ferris, a forensic investigator found something that made every other hypothesis evaporate in an instant. A bullet lodged in Gary's rib bone. That bullet, a .38 caliber round, changed the nature of everything. This was not an accident. It was not a medical emergency. Gary Ferris had been shot. A murder investigation had begun on what was supposed to be a family holiday weekend, on a property full of the man's own children. Detective Daniel Hayes of the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office took the lead. He was the kind of investigator who understood that patience is not passivity, that in cases like this one, where the crime scene has been literally burned away, the evidence that remains is precious and irreplaceable, and every step must be taken with care. Hayes and his team returned to the property with new eyes and new purpose. They examined the house itself, particularly the basement, where Gary had last been seen alive. What they found there mapped the shape of a crime. Blood. Human blood, confirmed through forensic testing to belong to Gary Wayne Ferris, was present on the kitchen floor, on the stairs leading down to the basement, and on the basement floor itself. The trajectory of the blood told a story. The violence had begun upstairs, in the kitchen, perhaps in the middle of an argument, perhaps at a moment that transformed without warning from words to something irreversible. And Gary had managed to move, bleeding, down the stairs to the basement below. On the basement floor, detectives found a second piece of evidence that completed the picture. Another .38 caliber bullet, matching in type and caliber to the one recovered from Gary's rib bone. He had been shot once in the kitchen. He had staggered or crawled downstairs. He had been shot again. And then, somehow, in a detail that would become one of the most debated and disturbing elements of the entire case, his 300-pound body had been moved from the basement to the burn pile, approximately 50 yards away, and set alight. Someone had done all of this. Someone who had been in that house. Someone who had known where the guns were kept, who had access to every room, who had remained on the property long enough to do what needed to be done to hide what had been done. Melody Ferris cooperated with detectives in the days that followed. She gave her account of the night of July 3rd. The brief conversation, Gary going downstairs, everything normal, no indication of what was to come. She expressed the appropriate distress of a widow. She answered questions. But for Detective Hayes, something in the picture didn't resolve cleanly. The burn pile, the body, the blood trail that started in the kitchen, a room that Melody had access to, that Gary would have had no reason to avoid, that was entirely consistent with a domestic confrontation rather than an intrusion. There was no evidence of a break-in, no evidence of an outsider's presence. The property was large and private, well set back from the road, the kind of place where a crime could be committed and contained without a single outside witness. And then came the detail that, more than anything else, fixed Melody Ferris in the center of the investigation. In the days immediately following Gary's disappearance, before the body had been positively identified, before the burn pile had been officially linked to Gary's death, Melody Ferris made a statement to police describing the burn pile as the likely location of Gary's body. Investigators had not told her that human remains had been found there. No public announcement had been made. Only the killer and the investigators themselves knew what the burn pile contained. That statement, Hayes later told close to a confession as anything that came through an ordinary conversation. At that time, he said, only the killer could have known Gary was on the burn pile. As the investigation deepened, more details accumulated around Melody. Her marriage to Gary had been fractured by the 2009 affair, one that prosecutors argued had never fully healed. By 2018, there was a second affair, compounding the damage. The couple had been arguing about finances, The kind of argument that in a household with significant assets can become existential. About who controls what, about what the future looks like if the marriage ends, about what is owed and what can be withheld. And above it all, Melody Ferris was the sole beneficiary of Gary's life insurance policy, $2 million payable upon his death. On June 18, 2019, nearly 12 months after Gary's remains had been found in the burn pile, Detective Hayes determined that the investigation had gathered sufficient evidence. Melody Ferris was arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. Between the arrest in June 2019 and the trial in October 2024, 5 years passed. 5 years in which the Ferris family, already shattered by Gary's death and Melody's arrest, continued to exist in a suspended state of unresolved grief and unresolved justice. Scott Ferris, who had found his father's remains, who had called 911 with ash on his shoes and grief in his throat, continued to cooperate with investigators. He testified about what he had seen, what he remembered, what he had noticed in the days before his father vanished. He also became, as the case evolved, a target. Melody's defense strategy, which would only become fully apparent during the trial itself, centered on the idea that Scott, not Melody, was the more likely suspect. The defense pointed to the fact that Scott was the only member of the family known to possess .38 caliber ammunition, the type of bullet that had killed Gary. They pointed to the financial relationship between Scott and his father, noting that Scott had frequently borrowed money from Gary, creating a potential point of conflict. And they pointed to a polygraph test that Scott had allegedly not passed, raising questions about his truthfulness. Scott denied everything. He sat in the witness box during the trial, facing a courtroom that included his mother, and stated clearly and emphatically that he had not killed his father and had not helped to dispose of his body. He wept when he described finding the remains. He was not, by the observation of those present, a man performing grief. He was a man living it. The autopsy, completed in the months after Gary's death and crucial to the timing of the arrest, confirmed that Gary Wayne Ferris had died from gunshot wounds. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's crime lab extracted Gary's DNA from the spent bullet recovered at the scene, providing the forensic link between the physical evidence and the identified victim. The cause of death was homicide. The manner was clear. Only the question of who, exactly, had fired those shots remained officially unresolved until the trial. The trial of Melody Walker Ferris opened on October 7, 2024, in a Cherokee County Superior Court courtroom before Judge David Cannon, Jr. It would last 18 days. 3 weeks of testimony, evidence, expert witnesses, and competing narratives that sought to construct two entirely different pictures of the same family, the same crime, and the same night. Prosecutor Jeffrey Fogus laid out the state's case with a methodical precision that matched the physical evidence. He described the evening of July 3rd in the kitchen of the Purcell Lane house. An argument between Gary and Melody, the dispute about money and about the affairs that had never been fully addressed, the confrontation that tipped from words into violence. Fogus argued that Melody shot Gary in the kitchen. That Gary, wounded, made his way down the stairs to the basement. The blood trail confirmed it. That Melody shot him again. And that then, in what Fogus characterized as a deliberate and calculated effort to eliminate evidence and claim the insurance payout, she moved Gary's body to the burn pile and set it alight. The defense mounted a formidable counterargument. Attorneys John Luke Weaver and Michael Ray pointed at Scott throughout the proceedings, returning to him again and again as the more plausible suspect. They raised the .38 caliber ammunition. They raised the financial disputes between Scott and his father. They raised the polygraph. And they raised what became the most visceral physical argument of the entire trial. The question of how Melody Ferris, a woman they described as small and slight, could possibly have moved a 300-pound man from a basement to a burn pile 50 yards away. It is impossible, Weaver told the jury. Absolutely impossible. The defense also challenged the trajectory of the investigation itself, arguing that Detective Hayes and his team had suffered from confirmation bias. that they had decided early on that Melody was guilty and had built the case around that conclusion rather than following the evidence wherever it actually led. Everything that was done in this case was tailored specifically to attempt to convict Melody, Weaver argued in his opening statement. The prosecution countered that the physical evidence was not a matter of interpretation. Blood in the kitchen, blood on the stairs, blood on the basement floor, a bullet matching the one in Gary's ribs, found on the basement floor, Gary's DNA on the spent shell, Melody's statement about the burned pile, made before any official confirmation that Gary was there. These were not theories. They were facts, documented and tested in a laboratory, immune to the kind of reframing that a defense attorney could bring to bear on witness testimony or investigative procedure. Daughter Amanda Ferris took the stand and provided testimony that undercut the defense's effort to portray Gary as already suffering physical deterioration. She confirmed she had seen a wound on her father's leg in the days before he vanished, a detail the prosecution used to support its account of the sequence of events. The jury deliberated for 4 days. In a case this complex, with this many contested facts and this much emotional weight, 4 days of deliberation speaks not to indecision but to conscientiousness, to a group of people taking seriously the gravity of what they had been asked to decide. On November 4th, 2024, the jury returned its verdict. Melody Walker Ferris was found guilty on all 5 counts: malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, concealing the death of another, and making a false statement to police. When the verdict was read aloud in Judge Cannon's courtroom, Melody Ferris was taken immediately into custody. She had been free for the 6 years that the investigation and legal process had consumed. She was free no longer. December 5th, 2024. The courtroom in Cherokee County filled one more time with the people whose lives Gary Ferris's death had reshaped. His children were there, the lawyers, the detectives who had worked the case across years. Judge David Cannon Jr. presided. Melody Ferris was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. What she chose to say, and how she chose to say it, stunned the room. Rather than expressing remorse for Gary's death, rather than acknowledging the verdict or the suffering of her children, Melody stood before the judge and pointed her finger directly at her son. She accused Scott Ferris of being the one who had killed his father. She accused him of a cover-up, of lying on the stand, of failing a polygraph. She pleaded with the court to reconsider, to pursue Scott, to find the real killer. She said she wanted to watch her son brought into court in chains. The irony of that statement, that the moment of her own sentencing became, in her mind, a forum for deflection, was not lost on anyone present. Judge Cannon was unmoved. He sentenced Melody Ferris to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 30 years, noting pointedly that she was unlikely to live long enough to qualify. He ordered an additional 5 years for concealing Gary's death by burning his remains, and further time for making false statements to investigators. He also ordered her to have no contact with any member of the Ferris family, a restriction that, coming at the end of a trial in which she had publicly blamed her own son for the murder, carried its own particular weight. District Attorney Susan Treadaway addressed the gathered media after the sentencing with the measured certainty of a prosecutor who had waited 6 years for this moment. In July 2018, she said, a horrific murder occurred in Cherokee County. A man was shot, then left on a burned pile, where his remains were later discovered. The victim, Gary Ferris, was killed by his wife on his own property. The shocking facts of this crime will forever remain with all who were involved in this case, including first responders, prosecutors, jurors, and witnesses. Scott Ferris walked out of that courthouse carrying something no verdict could fully lift: the knowledge that his mother had stood before a judge and accused him, in public, of killing his father. The accusation was not new. It had been the spine of the defense throughout the trial, but hearing it from her own mouth, at her own sentencing, was something different. It was its own kind of violence. He had, nonetheless, told the truth. He had cooperated with investigators from the very beginning. He had wept on the witness stand remembering finding his father's remains in the ash. He had sat through 3 weeks of a trial in which his mother's attorneys had pointed at him, again and again, as the person truly responsible. And the jury, having weighed every piece of evidence and every competing claim, had concluded that the story the defense had constructed around Scott Ferris did not hold. Gary Wayne Ferris himself, the man at the center of all of it, had spent his last moments in the basement of the house he had built his life in, wounded and alone. He had been, in the words of the prosecutor who sought justice for him, a larger-than-life patriarch, a successful attorney, a father of 4, a man who had fought his way to every measure of success that his ambition had set for him. He had survived decades of legal practice, of complex financial negotiations, of the quiet and wearing battles of a long marriage. He had not survived a single evening in July, in a kitchen in Alpharetta, Georgia, where the last argument became the last everything. A $2 million life insurance policy sat uncollected. His property on Purcell Lane, where he had once imagined a future, was now the site of evidence markers and memory. His children would carry the weight of this story. What was done to their father, what was done at their sentencing, what was said about one of them in a courtroom that the whole country was watching for the rest of their lives. There is a particular cruelty in cases like this one, where the violence does not end with the death but continues outward in rings. Through the investigation, the arrest, the years of waiting, the trial, the verdict, the sentencing, and finally the silence after, when the courtroom empties and the family is left with nothing but each other, and the question of how to be a family after everything that has been said and done and proven. The fire that burned Gary Wayne Ferris reduced his body to ash and bone, and a single bullet lodged in his rib. But it could not burn away the truth. It could not burn away the blood on the kitchen floor, the stairs, the basement. It could not burn away the words spoken before anyone official had confirmed what that burn pile contained. In the end, the evidence that survived was enough. And in a Cherokee County courtroom, 6 years after the fire went out on Purcell Lane, the jury made certain that Gary Wayne Ferris was not simply consumed and forgotten, that what happened to him was named, and that the person responsible was held to account for every last count of it. Story 6. There are cases that haunt a justice system not because they remain unsolved, but because the person at the center of the mystery was the justice system itself. Jonathan Luna was not a victim found in an alley, not a stranger whose life the law was called to examine from a distance. He was an assistant United States attorney, a federal prosecutor, a man who had spent his career building cases against criminals, presenting evidence before juries, and standing on the side of the state against those who broke its laws. When his body was found face down in a rural Pennsylvania creek at dawn on December 4th, 2003, the irony was almost unbearable. The man who had devoted himself to uncovering truth had become, in death, one of the most impenetrable mysteries in the history of American law enforcement. More than 2 decades later, no one has been charged. A $100,000 federal reward sits unclaimed, and Jonathan Luna's family waits in a silence that the law, for all its power, has never been able to fill. He was born on October 21st, 1965, in the South Bronx, New York City. His father was Filipino and his mother was African American, a woman from the American South, and together they raised their son in the Patterson Houses, a public housing complex in the shadow of Yankee Stadium. The South Bronx of the 1960s and 1970s was not a forgiving place. It was a neighborhood shaped by poverty, by crime, by the particular exhaustion of communities that the rest of the city had decided to look away from. Jonathan Luna looked inward instead. He was, by every account, a quiet and determined young man, the kind of person who transforms the conditions of his beginning into the fuel for something larger. He attended Fordham University for his undergraduate degree, then made his way to the University of North Carolina School of Law, where his roommate was Reggie Shuford, a man who would later speak of Jonathan with both admiration and grief. From UNC Law, Jonathan entered the world of serious legal work, a position at the prestigious firm Arnold & Porter in Washington, D.C., then a role at the Federal Trade Commission, and then the move that would define the rest of his working life. A position as a prosecutor, first in Brooklyn, and then in Baltimore, where he became an assistant United States attorney. He was, in the language of institutions, a success story. A man from the Patterson houses, prosecuting federal cases in Baltimore's U.S. District Court. He had married Angela Hopkins, an obstetrician, in August 1993, and they had built a life together. A home, 2 children, the structure of a family that a man works hard to protect. To look at Jonathan Luna from the outside was to see a portrait of someone who had done everything right. And yet, on the night of December 3rd into the morning of December 4th, 2003, something happened to him that no one has ever been able to fully explain. To understand the final hours of Jonathan Luna's life, you need to understand the case that was consuming him in the weeks leading up to his death. He was the lead prosecutor in a drug case involving 2 defendants named Warren Grace and Anthony Harris. It was the kind of federal narcotics case that passes through U.S. district courts with some regularity, serious, important work, but not the sort that makes headlines. The case had hinged, as many such prosecutions do, on the testimony of a government informant. And that informant, at the critical moment, had changed his testimony. He was no longer cooperating. The case that Jonathan had been carefully building was now wobbling on its foundation. On the evening of December 3rd, Jonathan responded to the crisis the way a diligent federal prosecutor would. He reached out to the defense attorneys for Grace and Harris and offered a plea deal. The defense attorneys accepted. Now the paperwork needed to be finalized. A plea agreement had to be drawn up, reviewed, and transmitted before court proceedings could continue. Jonathan sat at his desk in the federal courthouse on Lombard Street in Baltimore and began the work. Computer logs would later show him still editing the document at 11:38 p.m. He had promised the defense attorneys he would fax over the finalized documents. The fax never arrived. What Jonathan did next is the part of this story that has never stopped demanding an explanation. At approximately 11:30 p.m., he gathered himself and prepared to leave the courthouse. It was the middle of the night in the middle of the week, in a building full of people who were, presumably, still at work. And as Jonathan walked out, he left behind 2 things that, for a man about to drive a car, were not small omissions. He left his cell phone on his desk, and he left his glasses, the glasses he needed to see clearly enough to drive. He got into his Honda Accord and drove out of the courthouse parking garage. He had an active E-ZPass transponder mounted on his windshield, the kind of electronic toll device that allows drivers to pass through toll booths without slowing, without stopping, without any human contact at all. But as he drove northeast on Interstate 95 into the night, Jonathan did not use his E-ZPass. At each toll, he slowed to the staff cash lanes and collected paper tickets. Every stop was a moment of human contact. Every paper ticket was a record. Whether this was a man who was afraid of being followed and wanted a paper trail of his movements, or a man who was already being told what to do, stopping where someone instructed him to stop, is a question that investigators have never been able to answer. What is certain is that the choices Jonathan made that night do not resemble the choices of a man acting freely and alone. At 12:57 in the morning, Jonathan's ATM card was used at the JFK Plaza Service Center near Newark, Delaware. He withdrew $200 in cash. Cash that leaves no further trail, that passes from hand to hand without record. By 2:47 a.m., he had crossed the Delaware River toll bridge and was on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. At 3:20 a.m., his debit card was used again, this time to buy gasoline at the Sunoco station at the King of Prussia Service Plaza, just outside Philadelphia. Surveillance footage captured a figure near the gas station at that hour, though the FBI would later assess the footage as too grainy to be definitively useful. Someone at a Roy Rogers restaurant at a rest stop along the route later claimed to have seen Jonathan that night, to have recognized his face, his court ID badge, his suit. FBI investigators ultimately doubted this account, but the image it creates, a federal prosecutor in a suit and black overcoat, alone in a highway rest stop at 3 in the morning, his court ID badge still hanging around his neck, moving through a world of late-night travelers who didn't know who he was or what he was driving toward, is one that has never left the imagination of those who have followed this case. At 4:04 a.m., Jonathan's car exited the Pennsylvania Turnpike at the Reading-Lancaster interchange. He paid with his paper toll ticket. When investigators later examined that ticket, they found something that made the blood run cold, a spot of blood. It was Jonathan's blood, and it was already on the ticket at the moment he handed it to the toll attendant. He was already injured when he exited the highway. The Sensenig and Weaver Well Drilling Company sits on Dry Tavern Road in Brecknock Township, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a quiet, rural stretch of land where the kind of person who gets up at 5 in the morning to go to work at a drilling company would not, ordinarily, expect to find a federal prosecutor dead in a creek. But that is exactly what the first arriving employee found on the cold morning of December 4th, 2003. At 5 a.m., the first worker arrived for the day shift. At 5:30 a.m., the Honda Accord was noticed. Its lights were off. Its front end had been driven, or pushed, partially into the narrow creek that ran alongside the property. The driver's door was smeared with blood. The car's engine was still running. Jonathan Paul Luna was face down in the creek beneath the engine of his own car. He was still wearing his suit. His black overcoat was still on him. His court ID badge was still around his neck, as though the man and his profession could not be separated even in death. Lancaster County Coroner Barry Walt performed the autopsy. What he found was a body that told a story of sustained, terrible violence. A story so complex and contradictory that it would fuel debate between law enforcement agencies for the next 2 decades and beyond. Jonathan Luna had been stabbed 36 times. 23 of those wounds were to his neck. 5 were to his chest and abdomen. 7 were to his hands. There was also blunt force trauma to his face, his neck, his groin, and his upper extremities. A circular bruise marked his left wrist, the kind that suggests restraint, that a wrist was held or bound. There were incisions over both knees and the back of his legs. The cause of death, despite all those wounds, was drowning. Jonathan Luna had been alive when he entered the creek. However damaged, however weakened, he had still been breathing when the cold Pennsylvania water closed over his face. Inside the car, investigators found a pool of blood on the floor of the rear seat. Not the driver's seat, not the passenger seat, but the back. The pool of blood in the back seat suggested that at some point during the night, Jonathan had been in the back of the car while someone else was driving. A second blood type was also discovered in the vehicle. Someone else's blood was in Jonathan Luna's car, and a partial fingerprint, not belonging to Jonathan, was lifted from the evidence as well. The Lancaster County coroner ruled the death a homicide, and then the story fractured, because while the Lancaster County authorities and 2 successive county coroners maintained unequivocally that Jonathan Luna had been murdered, the FBI moved in a different direction entirely. The Bureau's investigators, who had called the case one of their highest priorities in the immediate aftermath, began to lean toward a different conclusion, that Jonathan Luna had killed himself. The suicide theory was built on a collection of details that investigators, or perhaps those who wanted a particular conclusion, had assembled into a portrait of a man under extreme pressure. There were reports that $36,000 had gone missing from a robbery case that Jonathan had previously prosecuted, and that he had been scheduled to take a polygraph test about it. There was a credit card his wife Angela did not know about. There was a $25,000 debt. His name had apparently appeared on an internet dating website. Individually, each of these details might be explained in any number of ways. Together, they were used to construct the outline of a man whose life was collapsing beneath its surface. A man who, the suicide theory suggested, had driven into the dark of a Pennsylvania night and ended his own life in a rural creek. But the suicide theory collided with something the autopsy revealed in November 2025, when the Lancaster County records were finally unsealed after a lengthy court battle led by the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Jonathan Luna's small pocket knife, The knife that early leaks had insisted he had used to inflict his own wounds was found on his person, closed and unopened. There was no blood on it, not a trace. The knife that was supposed to be the weapon of self-destruction had never been unfolded. In the weeks and months after Jonathan's death, the investigation took a turn that has never been fully explained. CBS News reported that supervisors at the FBI's Baltimore field office had begun focusing, internally, on one of their own female agents as a possible suspect in the murder. The agent's name was not made public, but sources told CBS that she and possibly a senior colleague had become the subject of an internal FBI probe. Even as field agents continued their work independently and reportedly discovered a knife that may have been the actual murder weapon, leading investigators to what one source described as a very promising suspect. What happened to that suspect, whether the lead was pursued, suppressed, or simply dissolved, has never been made clear. The internal investigation into the FBI agent reportedly faded without public resolution. The promising suspect was never charged, and the case, with all its evidence and all its unanswered questions, continued to accumulate years. In 2007, Jonathan's family, refusing to surrender to the silence, hired a private investigator and an attorney and filed a petition seeking to force the Lancaster County coroner to conduct a formal inquest into the death. The petition was declined. In 2020, a newspaper requested that a judge unseal the coroner's records that had been in the county's possession all along. In January 2021, the judge ruled that the documents would remain sealed, writing that releasing them would pose a threat of substantially hindering or jeopardizing the open, active, and ongoing criminal investigation. That language, open, active, and ongoing, has been used to describe this investigation for more than 20 years. Among all the details of this case, one returns again and again with particular weight: the blood on the toll ticket at the Reading-Lancaster interchange. It was 4:04 in the morning. Jonathan was already bleeding when he handed that ticket through the window to the toll attendant. A real person, working a night shift on a Pennsylvania highway, took that ticket from a bleeding man's hand and let him drive on. They did not know. How could they have known? A car stops at a toll plaza. The window comes down. A hand extends with a ticket. The attendant processes the transaction and waves the car through, turning to the next vehicle before the taillights have even disappeared around the bend. A bleeding man drives on into the dark, and the toll attendant goes home at the end of their shift with no idea that they were the last person to interact with a federal prosecutor who would be dead within the hour. It is this kind of detail, ordinary human contact pressed against the edge of catastrophe, that makes the Jonathan Luna case so persistently unsettling. It did not happen in a vacuum. It happened along highways that thousands of people were also traveling that night, at gas stations and rest stops and toll plazas staffed by ordinary people, in a parking lot outside a drilling company where workers arrived at 5 in the morning with coffee and work gloves and no idea what they were about to find. In November 2025, 22 years after Jonathan Luna's body was pulled from that creek, the Lancaster County coroner's autopsy records were finally made public. The release came after a court battle fought by the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, an organization that had argued for years that the public had a right to know what had been found in that examination. The document, once described as lost, had never been lost at all. It had been sealed, kept from view, locked away in county records while a family waited, and a $100,000 reward went unclaimed. When its contents were finally known, they confirmed what the Lancaster County coroner had concluded in 2003. The manner of death was homicide. Not accident. Not suicide. Homicide. The autopsy described wounds consistent with the use of a can opener, spike, knife, tool, mark, fingernail marks. Multiple instruments. Multiple kinds of force. It described blunt force trauma to areas of the body that no suicide victim inflicts upon themselves. It described a man who had been hurt systematically, deliberately, over a sustained period, before he was left face down in the cold water of a Pennsylvania creek. 22 years is a long time to wait for the truth. It is long enough for children to grow into adults, for a city to change its skyline, for the people who knew a man to age into the quiet acceptance that justice, in this case, may never come. Angela Luna, the obstetrician who married Jonathan in August 1993, who built a life with him, who had 2 children with him, has spent more than 2 decades in that waiting. The question of what happened to Jonathan Luna in the hours between leaving the Baltimore courthouse and being found in that creek has never been answered satisfactorily. The questions multiply rather than diminish. Why did he leave his glasses, essential for driving, behind? Why did he leave his cell phone? Why did he choose cash lanes when his Easy Pass would have been faster and easier? Where did he go during the gaps in the timeline that investigators could never fully account for? The stretches of time unaccounted for between his known locations. Who drove the car while Jonathan bled in the back seat? Whose blood was in the car? Whose fingerprint? The drug case he was prosecuting, the missing $36,000, the internal FBI investigation, the promising suspect who was never charged, the sealed autopsy that took a court battle to release. Every layer of this case, when lifted, reveals another layer beneath it. Jonathan Luna was a boy from the Patterson houses in the South Bronx who taught himself to reach higher, who studied law, who built a family, who put on his suit and his black overcoat every morning and went to work for the United States government. He was 38 years old. He had 2 children. He had spent a December night editing a plea agreement at his desk, alone in the Baltimore courthouse while the city slept. He deserved to come home. The federal reward for information leading to a conviction remains, as of 2026, at $100,000. It has never been claimed. The case is officially still open. And somewhere along the back roads of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, past the highway where the toll attendant once took a ticket from a bleeding man's hand and waved him on, the truth of what happened to Jonathan Luna is still waiting to be found.